Maximizing your sales in the fourth quarter while you're selling on Amazon or any other platform is extremely important. And one way to make sure that that happens is through having a properly set up repricer. And so today I am bringing on one of the co-founders of the repricer Aura named Dillon Carter. Now, he's been on the channel multiple times before. It is the repricer that I personally use in my own businesses. And so I'm excited to have him on to talk about different strategies and ways to maximize your profits and your repricing during the fourth quarter. And so now, if you're interested in getting started with Aura and you're a newer seller, you're doing under $10,000 per month in sales, they have an amazing repricing plan that's called their early stage program. You can actually access that at askjimmysmith.com/early stage. It's only $27 per month if you're a newer seller, and you can jump in right away and use all of their advanced strategies. However, if you're an advanced seller and you're somebody that's doing over $10,000 per month or even hundreds of thousands of dollars per month, Aura is still an excellent repricer with the best AI options out there and so many other things, as you'll see in this video. You could head over to that same exact link, check out Aura, and be sure to sign up for their free trial, their free onboarding, and everything else that we discuss here. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the interview with Dillon Carter from Aura. Hey, Dillon, thank you so much for joining me back on the channel once again. Excited to have you here.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me back on.
Yeah, it's an interesting time. So we're recording this at the beginning of October. I'm in a mobile setup because I ran from a hurricane, but you were able to stay in Florida, which is good. But ultimately, because it's the beginning of October, I wanted to talk about some Q4 repricing strategies, some things that you're seeing at Aura, and would just love to get kind of an update also because it's been a while since I've had you on.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, Q4 is kind of an interesting time, right? A lot of people are not really thinking about changing their tools or implementing new things, but I think this is when it starts to matter the most. It's very easy to look at Q1, Q2 and be like, all right, nothing's crazy. That's when I'm going to implement a bunch of stuff. And by all means, you should be doing that. But going into Q4, you really want to make sure you're maximizing the opportunity. And I'll give you a good analogy here that I personally dealt with. So I used to do wholesale for context, and I was up in Boston, actually, first time, just going up to Boston and peak Q4. And I got this amazing toy brand direct deal. And so I ordered plenty, at least I thought so. Now they're getting checked in batches of 100. They would get checked in. I'd refresh Seller Central on my phone and they would be sold out in like 5 minutes. Like it was astronomical. It was incredible. So I knew I was going to run out relatively fast, like within a few days. So I called the brand and said, hey, I need like 10,000 of these. And they said, love to hear that. We don't have any, period. Like we will not get them from the manufacturer until like February of next year. So is that a bad scenario? Not necessarily, right? Like I'm not stuck with inventory, but there is this sweet spot, right? You don't want to be stuck with inventory, but you also don't want to run out of stock too soon either. And so I think where a lot of sellers get stuck is they think they're getting the most out of it, out of the Q4 season. But how much, right? What's the opportunity here? And how much of that are you capturing? Because if you're only capturing 40, 60%, there's a lot more we could do, right? And I missed out on tens of thousands of units that would have been highly profitable that I just didn't predict. And part of that was my repricing. I was actually being too aggressive. And actually at the time, I wasn't repricing. I was manually just adjusting. And so what I could have done is actually slowed down my velocity a bit because I didn't need to move however many thousands of units in 24 hours. I could have slowed that down and increased my profit margin by quite a bit. And so going into Q4, you really want to think about one, the chaos, right? Like we tell everybody, listen, if it's your first Q4, just ride the roller coaster because that's what it's going to feel like, which is incredible. But what you want to keep in mind is that chaos is the opportunity. Now, as humans, it's really difficult for us to handle complexity really fast. Well, what do sellers struggle with the most? It's speed and complexity. So where a lot of sellers come to us, going into Q4, they'll say, hey, what should I change? Or what's my Q4 strategy supposed to look like? To be honest, it shouldn't change. Now, the caveat is if you're using rule-based, yes, it should absolutely change. But rule-based is very rigid by design, right? It's going to do explicitly what you tell it to do. So there's no dynamics to it, right? There's nothing that's dynamically adjusting with the market. And this is what we worked on with Maven. Because when we rebuilt Aura, we took a step back and said, okay, what do we know? We know that every listing is fundamentally different than the next. What works on one does not necessarily work on the other. Nothing's really transferable in that way. So what you don't need is far more strategies. What you need is a model that can say, okay, let me analyze what's happening here and in real time decide and calculate what is success. And this is another problem. When you look at how we've historically measured success in repricing, it's been one of two things, right? It's been my buy box ownership percentage went up or my sales went up. Yay. But does that tell the whole story? Well, actually not, because you don't realize, or a lot of sellers don't realize, as your buy box ownership percentage is going up, that means your price is going down, which means your margin is also going down. So these are the two levers we have to play with, right? We have sales velocity and profit margin. Although they're opposing forces, at any given moment, there's an optimal price, this balance that we find. And that could go up and down, right? The optimal price for a toy in Q1, very different than that same toy in Q4. And so shouldn't your repricing also be that dynamic as the market itself is being that dynamic? Of course it should. And so one thing to keep in mind is a lot of people will move things super fast. But again, you could have been raising your prices and moving still probably 50% more velocity than, outside of Q4, but at a much higher profit margin, 20, 30, 50% in a lot of cases. So the difficulty in doing that with a rule-based strategy is, one, you're manually setting your max prices, or you're setting those based on cost, right? So ROI, profit margin, fixed profit. That means it's fixed, right? Like if the market goes up past your buy or your max price, that's where you're stuck. And so what we need is something that can kind of, I'm going to use the term breathe as the market is expanding. And so I think going into this Q4, that complexity is continuing to evolve in the marketplace, as it always will and has. And speed does really matter. And so if you have a system like Maven that we have, where it can dynamically set those max values and increase them as the market demands, we can also reset that optimal price and say, great, you actually can raise your price by $30 and still get great sales here. Why miss that out? And so for us, what we wanted is to say, change nothing. The system will change, right? And I think this is where technology is going. It's less about what do I as the individual user need to change and manipulate and all these things. And can we design a system that can do that itself? And that's where we've gotten to. And it's a really good place because it allows you to know that you're still getting the most out of things, even if you forgot. Because listen, we're all humans. You got a ton of orders and POs flying all over the place. Maybe you're testing PPC campaigns, all kinds of craziness. And it's very easy to forget things. And so we wanted to build something that even if you did forget, or even if you didn't know about something like the yo-yo strategy, you still get the added performance of those things, even if you don't know they exist.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I know that that's always a big question of how do you balance what strategies to switch between and everything. And one thing that I've really loved with using Aura is I just set it at the AI,
Yeah.
Maven settings and just let it kind of do its thing. And I've seen
Yeah.
really good results from that. I've talked about it on the channel a few times. But I guess what are some of those changes, right, that you have,
Yeah.
the AI make during this time? It's not an algorithm. So can you kind of
Right.
explain what's the difference between
Mhm.
changes you force versus changes the AI is making on its own because of the time period?
Yeah. Yeah. So one I already kind of mentioned, right, which is that optimal price. And we define success not as my sales went up or my buy box percentage went up for the reasons I already mentioned, and really understanding, well, if there's this optimal price, which tends to be above the buy box, if we can have you plus the buy box there as often as possible, that's success to us. Because again, that's finding that balance between sales velocity and profit margin. That's what we ultimately want. So as the market going into Q4 is going to increase, the demand's going to go through the roof. The supply is going to increase, but not nearly as much as the demand will. Your prices should be increasing. And so we want a system that we can allow it to go up as the market's changing. BSRs could change dramatically. That's something we look at. But also your competition, right? If we're all actively fighting one another, I can still use that information to understand what's my best optimal behavior, right? And this is where that game theory stuff comes into play. And game theory sounds super complicated. It's really not. It's just if you and I are taking turns in a turn-based game, and I have to go first and I don't know what you're going to do, I'm going to put you in one of two categories, either cooperative. So in repricing, that would be you're matching me, or uncooperative, meaning in repricing, you're going to price below me.
Mhm.
If I have to go first, I can do one of those two things as well. Now, what's the likelihood of you fighting me if I begin fighting you? It's much higher.
Yeah.
So the optimal strategy is I will match you. And if you match me, I'll continue doing the same thing until your behavior changes, then mine will. That's all game theory is. That's important though, because it allows us to understand every one of your competitors as they're changing. And here's the thing, like we all know that when we first come into stock, we're usually pretty conservative on pricing because we care more about profits at that point. But as time goes on, my capital gets stale, it's sitting in stock, long-term storage fees become a problem. So what happens is over time, I become more aggressive. We all do this. And the reality is that every one of your competitors is in a different phase of that same life cycle.
Mhm.
So what if we understood exactly what phase they're in? That's what we're using game theory to basically suss out. So if we know that and we know where we want to go as the market itself is moving, I now know what behaviors I need to deploy, aka what price changes I need to use to close that gap. So I can essentially use your behavior against you. And in a lot of cases, you get to benefit as well because I raised the buy box by 20 bucks,
Mhm.
right? Um, and that's where that complexity comes in, right? And even the yo-yo strategy, here's a good example. We're transitioning from a world of rigid rules to a world of nuance, which is kind of weird. The yo-yo strategy, a lot of people are used to this. You basically say every hour, every 3 hours at midnight, there's some kind of time frequency, raise my prices to my max and hold me there for an hour or whatever time period.
Mhm.
It's better for you to do that than not do that. However, how do you know that every 3 hours is optimal? And how do you know that when you raised it on that 3 hour mark, you could have got a sale still very profitable where you previously were that you now missed on?
Mhm.
And so this rigidness removes a lot of the opportunity. Instead, we want that nuanced approach, a behavioral approach.
Mhm.
I need to know when on each individual listing at each individual second, is that the time to do something like that?
Mhm.
Because if you're doing it every 3 hours, even once an hour, how do you know that that's enough or not enough? Maybe we can do it every 15 seconds. Shouldn't we be doing that? But as humans, again, we can't do this. We can't look at the data, process it, analyze it fast enough.
Mhm.
But AI can do those things. And so that's an example where even if you've never heard that term as a seller and you're using Aura, you're still benefiting from it. And that's so interesting. Like now you don't have to become the expert and be like, oh, what's the hack here that I see other sellers doing? And more like, I don't need to be a professional repricer here.
Mhm.
The nerds at Aura are doing that for me. And that's their job, which is true.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So instead of if you're using Aura, for instance, you can set up a workflow, and that workflow you can tell your prices to
Right.
go up to max every so often. Instead of doing that, you're saying that Maven and the AI side of it is doing that for the sellers
Yeah,
automatically. So,
exactly.
is there any need then to set up workflows or to set up anything else? Is it as
Mhm.
simple as, hey, just get in there and set up the AI strategy and let it go?
For the most part, I mean, workflows are still beneficial in the sense of when a new listing comes in, auto assign a certain strategy and enable repricing. So like from an automation standpoint, workflows are still useful. Um, we break this out into like 3 phases, that life cycle I was talking about, right? So level one, if you will, is defaulting to Maven. You're going to default to Maven. You're going to love it. And there are always exceptions though, right? There are always times where either you've held it too long and you want to become more aggressive. Again, sometimes that makes sense because you've held it too long. Okay, so we go to level two. Level two is a role-based strategy. It's the buy box targeting strategy because now we're saying I care a little bit less about profit margin and a little bit more about velocity. So by targeting the buy box directly, that's exactly what we're doing. And then the third phase or level three is a liquidation strategy. You could care less about profit margin and you want all the velocity to get your capital back. So what we're trying to do is say, okay, well, the model is this life cycle. How do you behave in each phase of the life cycle? And it's really just 3 strategies, which is really nice, right? Because gone are the days of having 15 plus strategies. I think I have a problem with that because what it does is it pushes the complexity onto the end user. It says you can do all these things, but you're not an expert in repricing. So the next question is, great, but what do I need to do?
Mhm.
In what way do I need to do this? When do I need to do this? And what we're trying to get to a world is less about the maintenance and the switching, and more so, can we have something that's robust enough to handle the vast majority of the cases, so that when you do need to go to phase 2, phase 3, it's really the exceptions.
Mhm.
And it's
Okay.
easier for people to comprehend, because what we do is very complicated. I mean, repricing is one of the, if not the most complicated software you can build in Amazon in that world. So our challenge is, how do we take that complexity, deal with it for you, and then create a product that's very intuitive and easy to understand, and also give you these mental models of how to think about it, because you are making decisions. And a lot of people don't know how to make those decisions correctly. And instead of going on Google and getting some random person's theories, we as the company who has the most data can say, well, actually, here's what we see work well at
Mm.
scale.
Okay. And so at what
Yeah.
point do you suggest then that people make that decision point to go from level one using Maven and
Mhm.
AI to going to level two with the buybacks or the liquidation
Yeah.
strategy? Because I know those three are in there. You even call them,
Yeah.
or at least level two and level three, right? And so I'm just curious, how is that decision recommended to be made?
It is slightly different for every seller. So it depends on how long you're willing to hold inventory and how you buy. Some people, I go to wholesale because it's an easy analogy. If I like to buy 2 weeks worth of inventory based on estimates, and I get to week 3, I might tell myself at week 3 is when I go to level 2, and then at week 4 I go to level 3.
Okay.
For RA sellers, it can be very different though.
Mhm.
Some RA sellers want to move super fast, and there's nothing wrong with that. Others are willing to hold a little bit longer.
Mhm.
So I always recommend sitting down and saying, okay, on average, when do I want to start moving things more aggressively? And this could change depending on how much capital you have available. If you're really tight on capital, you might want to move things through those phases faster than somebody who's flush with cash,
Okay.
right? Because again, what you're trading that profit margin for velocity.
Mhm.
And when you're strapped for cash, you really want a little bit more velocity.
Gotcha. Okay. And so, is there anything, and I don't remember if there was before, within Maven that after
Mhm.
30 days it starts getting more aggressive? Is that part of the strategy? Could you theoretically just leave it on level one and just let the AI do its thing?
That's where I would love for us to go.
Okay.
um,
Okay.
but here's what's cool about how we built it, right? It's not, when somebody says, hey, make strategies better. Okay, well, I have 3 options, right? I can add a setting, remove a setting, or change the definition of a setting. All 3 of those will break everybody's behaviors, because you assumed it works this way. And I just said, now it doesn't. And
Mhm.
so it kind of disincentivizes repricing tools from making those changes. That's why you get like 15 versions of a strategy. It's like, well, yeah, but like, now again, there's added complexity being pushed onto the user. Instead,
Mhm.
with this model, we're able to, in theory, go and say, well, what's the average time people do this on? Or maybe we give you that control and you say, okay, cool. At average age of 30 days, that's when I want to be more aggressive, and you just deal with it for me. Awesome.
Mhm.
We've theorized, could we do this with workflows, basically switching between those strategies? Certainly can. That is a little bit more complicated, because let's say your breakpoint's 30 days. We get to day 30, we become more aggressive, but now your age of inventory goes to 25 because you have
Mhm.
it spaced out for whatever reason. Do you still want it to be aggressive? Not really, not conceptually. And so from a workflow perspective, you need 2 of those, right? And so
Mhm.
not the end of the world, but not the best experience. I would rather say, let us again deal with that complexity for you, and you just say, listen, if my average age of inventory is greater than 30, be aggressive, and if it's not, do your regular thing.
Mhm.
That's easier for people to comprehend.
Okay. Yeah, that makes complete sense. Now,
Yeah.
I know too, inside of Q4, a lot of people love to do FBM, especially in November,
Yeah.
December, as products are running out of stock.
Mhm.
What do you recommend from a repricing standpoint? Is Maven still the thing to start with, or do you recommend setting
Yeah.
up separate settings?
Still Maven. Maven understands your offer type and your competitor's offer type. So it's
Okay.
getting that level of granular detail, which is nice, right? Because again, there's so many things we're like, so many variables we're not even going to talk about here, because it'd be a laundry list. But that's what's nice about it. It's like we have this thing where we can say it kind of doesn't matter, just start here.
Mhm.
And that same, life cycle model still applies, which is
Mhm.
awesome.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, and also too, inside of Q4, because I've just had a bunch of questions I want to ask you from the Aura side of things.
Yeah,
What do you recommend for people that bought a bunch of stuff to sell just Christmas type items, holiday items?
sure.
And obviously, I assume the AI doesn't know if something is, just specific for Christmas lights or something.
Right.
So, what do you recommend that people can build to be able to
Mhm.
systemize when they switch repricing strategies to be more
Yeah.
aggressive? Do you recommend putting that in their SKU? Is there someplace else in Aura that they can store that?
Yeah. So I like creating segments of products or listings based on the strategy. So you can have multiple iterations of Maven, which is cool, right? And so you could say, okay, well, I'm going to do the same three level, three phase thing Dillon's talking about, but I'm going to name the strategy slightly different, Christmas. Awesome.
Mm.
I would still go through those three levels, but I would compress the amount of time and I would set dates for myself. I would say, okay, well, we're not quite there yet. So I'm willing to be more conservative because, again, I don't want to run out of stock too soon. But when it's upon us, I'm going to go to level 2, make sure I get the most out of my velocity. And then as we're kind of coming out of that phase, I'm going to go switch to liquidation.
Okay.
I would set those time frames for yourself, and then just you can literally duplicate those three strategies and just name them slightly different.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I haven't done that actually. I've just set everything at Maven. I took the lazy approach. I've gone through so many different repricers, and I set up complex,
Yeah.
automations and things in prior ones. And ultimately, I was like, you know what, this is just so much to handle and to have other people handle. I'm
Yes.
just going to put it to Maven. I've seen really good results from it, and so it's
Yeah.
exciting to see that. But I know that right now, this is why we're talking, that I need to start setting up some more specific ones in Q4. So that's good to know.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of new sellers coming in and trying to set up repricing, maybe they don't have repricing set up. Do you
Sure.
recommend that now is the time to get that set up? And should they use Maven, or should they,
Mhm.
what are some resources that you recommend on that?
Yeah. This goes back to kind of how we started the conversation. Look, now is the
Mhm.
time to do it. Please,
Yeah,
please don't go into Q4 with not a repricer.
yeah.
It's still going to feel great, but you're
Mhm.
not getting the most out of it. And listen, if you're going to do 70% of your annual sales in Q4 alone, this does matter,
Mhm.
even for smaller sellers. So for us, we introduced the early stage program. So if you're doing less than 10 grand a month, you get access to Maven Hyperdrive, which we haven't talked about. Basically every feature you get access to for 27 bucks a month. Like we don't ding you on speed. We're not doing 15-minute repricing speeds here. It's all instant.
Mhm.
Um, and we do personal onboarding. A lot of it's funny because I put off repricing for the longest time as a seller because it was so daunting of a concept. And we knew that building this. And so we intentionally like personally onboard everyone, make sure like we're in your account with you, answering your questions, making sure like, yes, this is set up correctly. You can have confidence in it. Because a lot of times you're second guessing yourself. You're like, I've never done this before. I'm building these strategies. I hope I do it right.
Mhm.
We take all that complexity away from you. So in terms of like a newer seller, again, that same model still works.
Mhm.
Um, Especially when you're newer, don't worry about making it perfect. You just want to cover 80% of your bases. If you can do that, awesome. And we can help you do that in 15, 20 minutes. It doesn't take very much long. As you grow, as your volume's much higher, that's when a 2-5% delta has a meaningful impact, right? That could be hundreds of thousands of dollars in some cases. So don't worry about getting it perfect, your first repricing tool.
Mhm.
Worry about getting it 80% of the way there, and then you will learn over time. But again,
Mhm.
what's nice is like we don't outsource, we don't have VAs in the company. So like if you need help, need to jump into a Zoom call, we'll just do that with you and help you basically become a superhuman at repricing. Um, and to your point about having set up all this complexity and stuff, it is time consuming. And I think
Mhm.
that's why a lot of people put it off, especially newer sellers, because they're like, well, that's a whole other job basically I have to create for myself. And again, it's very complex. So did I do it right? Did I do it wrong? I really don't want to make a wrong decision going into Q4. I agree.
Mhm.
So for us, it's how do we remove all that friction and help you get the best performance possible, even if you don't understand.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. So I
Yeah.
totally agree because whenever I first started, I had to figure out what rules I wanted to set up because that's how it was initially, right back
Yeah.
in 2016 or something. Whenever I set up my first repricer, but then it gets more complex, and this has just been so easy for me to use. Now, for the advanced sellers, right? We just talked a little
Yeah.
bit about the new sellers. You mentioned Hyperdrive. I'd love to talk or
Yeah.
have you talk a little bit about the importance of that in Q4, especially for
Mhm.
some more advanced sellers. I know that you have the option for new sellers as well, but ultimately,
Yeah.
yeah, talk a little bit to that.
Yeah, what's nice is, we're not designed to be just a beginner repricing tool that you leapfrog from. Like we're designed to be able to get started affordably and then grow. I mean, we have sellers doing many a millions a month with us. So we do all the advanced stuff. And what's cool, I mentioned the complexity and speed concept. Maven handles complexity, but how do we solve for speed? Speed's an interesting one because we've always had instant repricing, but instant does not mean instant, which is frustrating. It is instant in our system, what we can control, right? But when I submit an update to Amazon, on average, it's going to take 1.5 to 2 minutes round trip for it to be confirmed. Going into Q4, that starts to slow down quite a bit, right? That could be upwards of 10 minutes. We found a unique way, and as far as I look, nobody else has this functionality, which is really cool. So it's an Aura exclusive. We can do that full round trip in less than 10 seconds.
Wow.
So when does that matter? Well, Q4,
Yeah.
right? Q4 is when this matters. And what's nice is how we do it, highly complex. How you initiate it as a user is you click a button, a little toggle, you say, do it. And we go, great, gotcha, right? It's awesome.
Yeah.
Now, what happens when you pair an AI handling the complexity as things are rapidly changing, that chaos, and have it do it in less than 10 seconds and have that price be live? Turns out amazing things. Because I really don't care about how perfect everything is. If it's really slow to do it, you're missing the point. Because as an example, there could be a price change every 2 seconds on a listing, like between all the competitors. If I kick off an update at time 0 and it takes me 10 minutes to get it live, that price is technically out of date already. So as fast as you can compress that time down, the better. Because now we're really real time. That's where we want to get to. We don't want to get to what was the most recent thing that we saw, and but there's 3 things in between that by the time we went live. No, we want it to be as real time as possible because speed matters and it will continue to matter, especially when demand's going up so rapidly. An extra 5 minutes at an optimal price could be meaningful. And when you scale that to all your listings, you start to see the benefits of it.
Oh yeah, definitely. And I know too, from the standpoint, you mentioned that the buy box changes regularly. It also changes
Yeah.
regionally. So how is that kind of handled?
Yes.
Since every one product may have a different buy box in different
Yeah.
parts of the country, right? So how does that handled
Yeah.
with Maven?
It's not because I wish we could, right? So Amazon only has the concept of the global buy box. So there's no regional buy box concept in the API, which, you know, if and the thing you got to keep in mind too, even if they did, you can only ever have one price, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have 5 regionals that you're available in, you technically need to have 5 plus the global buy box price.
Mm-hmm.
So that gets really convoluted when you scale it out. Now the hack here though, right? I have a lot of our users that are like, hey, I've got everything perfectly optimized in Aura. This is awesome. What now?
Mm-hmm.
I usually say send in more inventory. It sounds like a cop out. It's not though, right? If you think about it, how do you get access to regional buy boxes? Well, you need to have your inventory in that region because regional buy boxes exist because they're able to compress the shipment time. Amazon cares about speed too. And so I tested this, a decade ago before this was even like a real concept. With some of my wholesale friends, we're like, let's just start sending in 10% more inventory until it breaks. And funny enough, every time we did it, and we thought we were like pushing the limit on, round 1, we'd get more sales. And we're like, oh, I guess it kind of makes sense because they're distributing my inventory more nationally. I wonder if that's something we're doing. And come to find out, regional buy boxes became a thing. So repricing tools can't really do anything with it right now. I'm hoping that will change. But again, you're still only going to have a singular price. So the biggest hack is just send in more inventory.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the
Yeah.
powerful things too, as we see Maven repricing things higher than what the typical buy box
Right.
is. One of the reasons they're selling is because of these regional buy boxes. And so that's a huge benefit.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I love seeing that happen. From your perspective, I know you do these interviews, you do weekly calls, right? As well, the office hour
Yeah.
calls that y'all have. What
Yeah.
what's one of your favorite tools or features of Aura that is less mentioned or less talked about? Is there anything that you're like, you know what, I wish this one was talked about more?
Yeah, that's a good question. I am a super fan of Maven and Hyperdrive because I think those are the two biggest performance increases we've ever seen.
Mm,
But it's less of a feature, but mobile doesn't get talked about enough.
yeah.
So we are mobile optimized. Actually, you can reprice on a Tesla. I've done this on mine.
Okay.
So you can have full self-driving going to your next RA location and be repricing on the Tesla
Wow.
screen, which is cool. Um, but mobile is important, right? Because there are times where you're not at your computer and you're like, oh, I forgot to do this thing.
Mhm.
Well, most people don't have task managers because they're not as nerdy as I am. And they're like, I'll just remember later. And then you don't. And then that's 16 hours later. You're like, oh my gosh, that's 16 hours. I'm now not repricing. That's a problem.
Mhm.
Well, what if you could just pull out your phone and do it right then? And so
Yeah.
everything you can do, including creating strategies, you can do on your phone and it's designed for it. Um, there's only, I think, one other company that technically has a mobile app, but it's not really designed for it. And so there's a lot of friction there. So for us, here ultimately, here's what I want to do. I want to provide the most cutting edge software to the average Amazon seller. Like you don't have to be doing tons of revenue to
Mhm.
afford the cutting edge stuff. Like Maven, all these things have been historically considered premiumly priced. I don't think that's correct. And so now, even if you're on early stage, you're using Maven, you're using
Mhm.
Hyperdrive. We're not dinging you for being a new seller. That's kind of
Mhm.
frustrating.
Yeah.
But we also want it to be accessible, right? Not just from a price perspective, but like just whenever a idea pops up or you're like, oh, I need to do that real quick, you just do it. I
Mhm.
want to reduce the friction of you getting amazing performance. And so we do
Mhm.
that in a number of ways, but I think mobile is something that never really gets brought up in these conversations.
Mhm.
But I think it's cool. So
Yeah. Well, and I love the mobile aspects and features, but as you mentioned, the design, I mean,
yeah.
the fact that the way that Aura has been designed is very user friendly,
Mhm.
simple to use. It works on mobile too. That's a rare thing to see, especially in Amazon software, let alone repricing software. And so I really
Right.
appreciate all the design elements you guys have put into making this simple and
Yeah.
easy.
No, I
Now
appreciate
I know
it. And,
we've
and
got it.
another
Oh, go ahead.
another thing we don't really talk about as often either. There's a setting on every page. You can turn on auto refresh. Here's what's cool about this. If you load up a web page on a listing, that data is frozen in time. That's just the way websites work. So let's say your kid's like, oh, hey, can you help me with this? You're like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And you come back 20 minutes later, and now you go to make a decision to change a setting or what have you, looking at the data that was loaded 15, 20 minutes ago.
Mm,
That to me is now an outdated decision.
yeah.
So you can turn on auto refresh on the page, leave it up, and every 5 seconds, the page is asking the back end to say, hey, do you have information that I'm not showing?
Mm,
And if it says yes, great, we just push it to the page. We're not refreshing the whole page. The data just changes in real time. So again, to get back to this, like speed matters. It doesn't just matter in terms of like how fast are we updating your price. It's also like the data you're looking at, because a lot of times you are making certain decisions or analyzing your data.
mhm.
And 15 minutes doesn't seem like a big deal. And listen, half a decade ago, it wasn't, but today it is. So we're trying to make everything as real time as we can.
Awesome. Yeah, and you guys
Yeah,
have done a great job at it. So that's why I
appreciate it.
use Aura. I love having you on the channel. I know we got a few minutes left. Is there any last minute advice you have, either repricing or whatever, for sellers in Q4 that are
Yeah.
coming up, either the first ones or just any advice you have?
Yeah, I think especially for sellers that are not repricing and you're kind of hesitant to jump in because it does feel overwhelming, please don't let that stop you because it's not in reality. And
Mhm.
so my biggest piece of advice is no matter what tool you go with, go through the free trial. Here's how you know if it's a good fit. You go through the free trial, don't give anybody a credit card, even us. And if you didn't make more during the trial than what it would have cost you to pay for it, don't use it and don't pay for it.
Mhm.
Another thing, not everybody does this. We do personal onboarding sessions. So it's like 20-ish minutes. It's free. We don't care if you have a credit card, how big your account is. We could care less. We don't even look.
Mhm.
So here's the hack. Jump into a free trial, immediately reach out to Casey on support, just open up live chat, say, I want an onboarding, please. And he'll
Mhm.
say, great, here's a link. Let's get you scheduled. Um, what I want you to do is get the most of the free trial. So even if we can't onboard you for a week, we'll reset your trial for a total of 14 days to actually get the performance. Because when people are like, hey, can you sell me on Aura? I'm like, no, I can't. Like, that's not what we do here. Instead, go sell yourself. You know what I mean? And most people become like fanatic about Aura, which I love. I'm sending out so many shirts right now. Which is awesome. But those are people where I've been like, hey, I'm not going to sell you on it. That's not what we do here. Just go take advantage of our team, get set up, make the most out of it, and then you tell me.
Mhm.
So that's the biggest thing. Like, don't let that fear or hesitation or overwhelm keep you from getting the most out of Q4, because it does matter, and it matters
Yeah.
the most right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I love it. Thank you so much for being on here, Dillon. And for anybody that is interested in trying out the early stage program, you can head over to askjimmysmith.com/early stage. If you are a more advanced seller, you can go to the same place and access the regular plans there. But ultimately, it's a great place to start if you're new, and to grow into an advanced business as you grow in your Amazon business. So, Dillon, thanks so much, man. I hope you have a great Q4, and I'll talk to you next time.
Thanks, Jimmy. Have a good one.
Thanks, you too. Bye. Hey, thank you so much for checking out that interview with Dillon and myself on maximizing repricing in Q4. If you're interested in checking out Aura at all, and trying out the trial in your business, you can head over to askjimmysmith.com/early stage. And there you can get access to all of the new seller features, as well as all of the advanced seller features that come with that plan. And I just love what Aura is doing and the team behind it. And so I'm excited to continue to promote it on the YouTube channel. If you have any questions, post them down below. We'll be sure to answer as many as we possibly can. And I hope you have a great rest of your day and a blessed rest of your week.